Hello, and welcome back to Oxford at Home. Certainly back for many of our regular viewers and listeners around the world during the course of this series of events which showcase research and thinking from around the University of Oxford while we're in the current UK lockdown. And if you are new today, welcome, and I hope you'll stay with us for the rest of the series. My name is Rana Mitter. I teach Chinese history here at the university, but my role today is as host for our speaker. And she's going to be talking about a subject which I think may have become rather pertinent for many of us during the last few months of the lockdown here, particularly while we've been homeschooling or looking after children and finding that maybe a few toys have been left around the place. In other words, have you ever stepped on a brick of Lego, for instance, and suddenly felt a shooting pain up your leg? Well, if you've wondered why that happens, then our speaker today is going to give us the science on why things hurt us, how they hurt us, and what we can do about it. There are plenty of myths around pain, and she's going to bust those, as well as ideas about placebos, and also talk about the importance of chronic pain and dealing with that. Our speaker is Professor Irene Tracey. Now, Irene is, I got the wrong way. Irene is the Nuffield Chair of Anesthetic Science and Head of Department of Clinical Neurosciences here at the University of Oxford. She's had a very long and very impressive career, and amongst the additional roles that she has held includes serving on the Council of Medical Research Council and being Deputy Chair of the UK's Medical Research Council Neuroscience Mental Health Board. And also she's been Associate Head of the Medical Sciences Division here at Oxford, which many entirely objective and unbiased surveys have pointed out is the best medical department in the world. So we couldn't really be better equipped than to have Irene with us today. Before we go to her talk, just a reminder that you can, as ever, give us your questions, comments, feedback, but particularly questions for the Q&A session on the chat section of Twitter or in YouTube, or of course via Facebook if you're doing it via Facebook. Irene's going to speak for about 15 minutes. We'll have about a quarter of an hour after that for questions. So please do send those in. And without further ado, I think let's hand over. Irene, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ron. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon to talk about my passion, which is all thing pain and all thing brain. But just a small correction there, Ron. I think you had an old version of my CV. So actually, I'm warden of Merton College as of these past 2 years, which was my old college, and I've gone back to give back. I'm very proud to be head of that, and I've stepped out of being head of clinical neurosciences, which is the department in which I still do my research, and that's now ably headed and looked after by Professor Kevin Talbot. So the slight shift in what I've been doing for the past couple of years, but I haven't let go of doing my research, which is to understand using neuroimaging how this subjective, private, complex experience is constructed in the brain, and what is it that we need to understand if we're going to really tackle chronic pain as this major global problem. So let's start with the good side of pain. Not all pain is bad. Good, or what we call acute pain, is your body's warning system. It's something that tells you that somewhere's hurt, so you locate it, you discriminate to work out what type of pain it is, you attend to it, you often have an emotional reaction, like staying on that Lego brick, you might even have an expletive. And then generally what that leads to is a decision and an action. You get away from it, you withdraw, you remember what caused it. So that's the good pain. It's your body's alarm system. It tells you something's hurt. It drives decision-making, it drives action, and it helps you remember what things hurt you so you can avoid them in the future. The bad side of pain, or the dark side of pain, this is what we call chronic pain, and this outlives that warning role. It is defined as a chronic pain state if you're still in pain about 4 months after the initiating injury and pain is still there or persistent. So that's the sort of definition of chronic pain, and it's of long duration. And it has an absolute devastating impact. And we're going to go a little bit more into that. And then there's just sort of the basic neuroscience of pain. Obviously, as I've detailed, there is this huge medical health problem, which is chronic pain. But just going back to that basic neuroscience, how on earth do we construct this very elusive, very private, very subjective experience? And that's still a mystery. And it's still a major outstanding question, neuroscience. So whilst we understand a lot about how the brain constructs the way we see and hear and taste and smell and touch, we still haven't really cracked how we feel pain. And that's really amazing, considering it's one of our oldest sensory and emotional experiences. So work to be done there and lots of exciting neuroscience to discover. Just going back to that chronic pain and just to sort of scene set a little bit why it's so important. Often one might think of it as just a symptom of something else. And that's fair enough. And that is traditionally how we thought of things. And to a certain extent, a lot of persistent pain does reflect a symptom from another process. But when chronic pain is persistent for years and years, it becomes a disease in its own right. So in fact, in the next big classification of diseases, for the very first time, chronic pain is being classified both as a symptom of something else, but also as a disease in its own right, with 7 different conditions listed. And this changes everything. And that really reflects the science. That reflects what we've discovered, and not just we, but lots of people around the world over these past few decades in terms of our understanding of this evolution and this holding and this persistence of chronic pain in patients. A staggering 1 in 5 of the adult population have chronic pain. There's comorbid anxiety and depression. Often it goes with job loss, huge untold suffering for the person and for the family. We tend to categorize chronic pain in 3 main groups: nociceptive inflammatory, so things like osteoarthritis, a dicky hip or knee, rheumatoid arthritis would be under that category. We then have neuropathic or nerve injury pain, and that would be things like phantom limb pain, or pain related, say, to multiple sclerosis, or maybe patients might have diabetes and they have a sort of nerve injury with that, and they have painful legs, so diabetic painful neuropathy. So I hope not, but presumably some of you out there might have that. And then the third category we call idiopathic or functional, because we're not quite sure what the cause is for that, and that's still to be understood. And in those categories would be things like fibromyalgia and irritable bowel syndrome. The conservative estimate of just how much chronic pain costs society in terms of treatment management, but also people not being able to go to work and do their jobs, so a loss to the economy, is about $600 billion per annum in the USA, and about 200 billion euros in Europe. So it's a huge, huge economic burden. And it is indeed one of the largest medical health problems in the developed world. Now, some of the challenges in us trying to understand pain so that we can have targets to go after and fix has been this issue that it is a subjective experience. And of course, it always will be. And your pain is your pain and my pain is my pain. And to a certain extent, we could get all philosophical, and maybe we will in the questions. You'll never really know somebody's pain, like you'll never really know somebody's subjective state. But what we try to do is measure it. We try to at least pin it down and understand things like how much, where, what's causing it, what are the mechanisms. And the tools we have to do that are mostly self-report. Just ask the person, pick a number, 1 to 10, how much pain you're in. If they're a child and they can't understand that, they might just point to a picture, happy face, sad face. If you haven't got that, and in addition, you'll look at behavior and you'll look at people's reactions and the way they express their pain. But of course, this is fraught with cultural and societal biases, both in terms of how people choose to express their pain, but also how you choose to judge that expression. And we all have biases there. So that's not particularly helpful often. And if you have none of that, and the person is comatose, or they're having an operation, so they're anesthetized, or maybe they're a demented elderly person or a sleeping baby, then you have to look at indirect physiology and look at things like changing in heart rate and other metrics. All of these are subjective, they're limited, and they lead to problems in diagnosis and in understanding it. So, and it even has repercussions in courts of law. So the problem is you cannot take a blood test to know if, how much, and why someone is in pain. I wish it was the case that we could, but we can't, because it's just not as simple as that. So we need what we call pain biomarkers for all these different situations that we might want it, not just in the clinic, not just to help industry make better drugs that will work, but also for lawyers in courts of law. We also need it in the veterinary care. We need to understand it in challenging situations where you don't have the luxury of the person telling you or observing. So there's all these situations where having a measure, an objective measure, something we can take and capture that could give us some understanding of explaining why somebody's pain is a certain way would be incredibly valuable. And that's the journey we've all been on over these years. So in terms of the whole thing about, how you actually experience pain, this is really built on what we call in neuroscience and in all our perceptions, whether it's seeing or hearing or smelling or touching, what we call the 3 neuron sort of order system. And the first business end is what we call transduction. And that's the sort of contact and communication with the external world. So this is where things that we know hurt us, which we generally put under 3 categories: the thermal, so burning yourself on a cup of coffee or freezing cold; the mechanical, and that would be stepping on that Lego brick or cutting yourself; and then the chemical, and that could be a sting from an animal, could be chopping chili peppers and getting that chili pepper in your eye. So those are the 3 main categories of things out there in the environment that can hurt you. And the transduction bit is how they come in and invade and bind to particular receptors that then basically start the process of sending the signals in. The next step of the journey is transmission, and that's getting the signals into what we call the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and then up to the brain. And that transmission process is really important. And again, all of perception, things like seeing and hearing and taste, all build on this transduction, transmission, perception process. So for pain, we've had this incredible explosion led by people like David Julius and Patty Putin in our understanding of the molecular basis of just how we talk to these things in the environment that are going to hurt us. And these are now targets for drug discovery to stop. The transmission process, sending the signals in, we've learned a lot about patients who don't feel pain. They have what we call congenital insensitivity to pain. This is a horrific X-ray of a patient who has shattered legs. You can see the breaks in the legs there. They felt absolutely no pain to that. Neither would they to this, because although this bit's working, and although the end game perception's working, the transmission bit isn't sending the signal in. And that's been terrific, again, discovery and work that has happened over the past decade or so. And that, again, is giving us new targets and new places that we could block to stop transmission in chronic pain. And then the final thing, of course, is the perception, is the brain getting those signals, putting it together, and you saying, ouch, that hurts. What should I do about it? Should I avoid it? So the perception piece is the final frontier that we're trying to understand. And all of these are necessary. Often in chronic pain, you might actually have quite less transmission and transduction, but there could be many big amplification processes now built up in the brain that's perpetuating it and keeping it on. And so all the different research groups over the years have been trying to fill these three areas: transduction, transmission, perception. And it's just terrific. And we can go into Q&A later about the discoveries and how those are providing us new targets for intervention. And again, when we think about perception, really that's been the mystery piece, because we haven't had tools to go into the human brain and look at it. So this 3 neuron order system is the bedrock of how we perceive things. Up until here, we call it nociception. So this transduction, transmission, it's all about receiving what we call tissue damaging signals, nociception. And pain doesn't become pain until the brain gets it. So until it hits the brain, it's not pain, it's what we call nociception. And once it gets to the brain, again, it's not that straightforward, because if the brain is an anxious brain, if it's a distracted brain, if it's a sad brain, that changes the substrate into which those nociceptive signals are coming, and it changes the way that they're processed, and it powerfully changes the experience that the individual will have. So it's not the same as Descartes had it back in the 16th century, which was supposedly a very faithful transmission of tissue damaging signals in a very linear, reliable, truthful way, just going up to the brain and ringing a bell. It's not as simple as that. We now know that all these factors, like being distracted, like being sad, your mood, the context of the situation in which you're experiencing pain, will powerfully change the way these signals are processed. But there's also powerful top-down signals that also will provide turning up and turning down options of these incoming signals, controlling what's allowed into the brain, controlling the pain experience. So we really move to a modern Descartes picture now, where we know these amplification processes that can make pain worse or can make it better exist both out there in the periphery, in the transduction, in the transmission, and then in the central nervous system, powerfully turning up and down and modulating experience. So it really isn't, unfortunately, a simple one-to-one mapping between the tissue damage and the experience. And I think that non-linearity between what's coming in and what you experience has caused a lot of the problems and a lot of the disbelief often in patients' pain, because we're very stuck with a medical model that we like to see a lot of injury and then we'll trust and believe that they're in pain. Well, hopefully already by now you can see it's more complex than that. And it could be you can see no injury, or it's a very small amount of injury. But that journey has amplified those signals. So now it's a powerful pain experience, and you wouldn't know it looking at the injury, and you would disbelieve them. And that's what's led to a lot of the myths and the biases that we have that we must overturn. And luckily we can now, because we've got tools to prove it. So these are the tools that we've got. We're very lucky in Oxford that we've had terrific support and investment in our programs of neuroimaging research. And again, I've been very involved in a lot of this over my career. So we can have all these different techniques that allow us to look at the human brain from a structural, a chemical, a functional, a wiring, electrical activity perspective. And we can piece it all together and give us these incredible anatomical, physiological, neurochemical insights into what's going on, all in vivo, all in the living person. So you can imagine how terrific and powerful that is. So when we come to, again, a situation where I might take Rana and I might burn them a little bit, and that's driving the nociceptive drive, those transduction, transmission signals coming into the spinal cord, up they go to the brain. But if I distract him, if I have changed the situation where it's very rewarding, the pain, if there's physical injury, if the person is grieving, if they are anxious about going to the dentist, they're very depressed. All of these things will powerfully change the brain. And even if the same signal is coming in, the way it gets processed and the pattern of activity will be different. And if the pattern of activity is different in the brain remembers where pain emerges. It is an emergent perception. You will change the experience. It's as simple as that. So what we've been able to do over the years is use a host of different paradigms where we've done exactly that. We've taken students, we've burnt them, we've poked them, we've prodded them, and then we've made them sad, we've made them happy, we've made them anxious. We've made them change the reward of the pain. We've hedonically flipped it. We've done all sorts of different things. And we've shown and proven what networks turn things up, turn it down, change the quality of the pain. And we've been able to dissect, if you like, this very complex pattern of brain activity to better understand how pain emerges as a perception and how it's modulated in different situations. And that's, again, relevant for the everyday pain and to explain everyday situations why at the end of running a marathon and your reward is there, although it's hurting like hell, you're happy about that pain. It's a positive pain because you've now just changed the value of what that pain means, how you reframe the meaning of it. Again, powerful brain processes making that pain happy pain. And again, why when the baby's being jabbed here and they're being distracted, they're not feeling the pain. It's because, again, we've understood the mechanisms that, again, top down will block the incoming signals, stop them coming in, and the baby won't feel the pain. So we've been able to, again, demystify a lot of these things that we've anecdotally experienced or seen, but we've never understood what on earth is going on because we've never had the tools to look at it. Well, let's go to chronic pain. What holds people in chronic pain? So again, let's look at three different types of patients with irritable bowel syndrome, an arthritic knee, and back pain. And what's interesting is they share sometimes an overlapping array of symptoms. And again, the symptoms can be devastating, like freezing cold, burning, pricks like door-ring pins jabbing into the feet or electrical bolts. One of the common symptoms all chronic pain patients experience is this constant ongoing pain. And that's the big one to go after. And that's been very difficult to image. We've been working with our physicists and developed new imaging tools, allowing us the first time to look at this ongoing pain and come up with new understanding of it. And that's now provided a surgical target that we've been working with our neurosurgical colleagues to target particular regions of the brain that we think are important in expressing ongoing pain. And this is a very exciting direction of travel for us. And again, it just illustrates the value of doing basic discovery research and then translating it into the clinic. So if we think about what holds people in chronic pain, the constant firing of the damaged nerves, sending those signals in all day, every day, all week, all month, all year, and for decades is the big one. And that's that ongoing pain. So we've got to stop the signals coming in. When they come in and they keep beating up the central nervous system, the spinal cord and the brain react to that. And they set off, unfortunately, these amplification systems, and they make it worse. They turn up the volume. And then with that unmet, with drugs not working, which is sadly largely the case to date, you have potential replasticization and what we call maladaptive plasticity, wiring up the brain and sort of almost hardwiring it on. And the final frontier is to try and understand who is that 1 in 5? Why is it 1 in 5 end up in persistent chronic pain, but 4 out of 5 recover? And we need to understand things about vulnerability and resilience towards developing or not developing persistent chronic pain. So the central sensitization thing, this amplification circuits, again, that's been a lot of the work that we've done, is to understand this very old system in the brain that's centered on one of the oldest parts of the brain, the brainstem, but wired up to really important areas of other areas of the brain, the frontal and cortical areas of the brain, this descending pain modulatory system. And you can think of it as good cop and bad cop. What it can do is communicate in that top-down manner to the point at which those nociceptive signals are being transmitted in. And if the bad cop's on, it's going to turn it up. If the good cop's on, it's going to inhibit it and block it, so it won't come in. So what you want is lots of good cop and not so much bad cop, because the good cop's going to block it, and so less comes in, you feel less pain. What we know from work that we've done and others is that in that transition and persistent chronic pain, you have an attenuation of the good cop, it withers away, and you've got too much of the bad cop coming online, and that's what's making it worse and holding them. So we've got to reset that balance, and that's a big target for us. So this is a busy slide, but it's just to stress that over 2 decades, we've really sort of nailed, we think, an understanding of this importance of this system, both from a basic discovery point of view, through to translating it into clinical populations, and through to working with industry to use it as a biomarker, as an assay for developing new drugs that will target this very important mechanism that we need to reset. And so again, a lot of work over the years towards that goal of calming down these amplification systems, resetting, bringing down the bad cop and boosting up the good cop. And of course, the good cop is something you want anyway, and it is something that naturally you will have used in your everyday pain situations where you've blocked pain without realizing what you've done. So again, going back to that child being vaccinated, the distraction, or this two rugby players going for the try, the goal of that, the nociceptive input here with this sneaky way of inflicting pain, or for the American colleagues out there, landing on your head like this hurts, this is nociceptive damage, transduction, transmission. But is the perception pain? Well, in this instance, no, because very high order frontal regions in that high arousal, in that distraction state, will think of it as lifting the brake off and allowing in that old brainstem this good cop to work. So it then drives systems top down, releases lots of endogenous opioids, it blocks the signals here. So those signals are not allowed into the brain. Well, if they're not allowed into the brain, you don't feel pain. So that's the free analgesia that we all have a capability of driving, and is indeed why we don't feel pain when we're distracted, high arousal, fight or flight response, listening to some music, watching a great film. And it is, in fact, to cut a long story short, the basis of placebo analgesia. We now know that placebo analgesia, which is a conditioning and expectation management of somebody expecting something but getting something else, what you're doing is you're setting this system off, driving the good cop, and that's what's producing the placebo analgesia. It's an incredibly powerful, very physiologically based thing. We have a lot of confusion about placebos in our modern medicine, thinking them as somehow bad, and somehow sort of, again, historically we thought of them as patients lying and there'd be placebo tests done. Lots of unfortunate myths about it. But what we now know from the science is that placebo is this very real, very powerful physiological. It's like squirting in opioids. It works. It is an incredible analgesic. It is an active thing. And it's the basis of patient-physician interactions. So when patients come to the clinic and they're talking about their condition, the physician will have a conversation with them and set expectations, set up good ones, dispel crazy ones. And those powerfully drive brain mechanisms. And it's a combination of what that patient's expectations are and brain networks, coupled with the drug that's given, that actually drives the outcome therapeutically. And we know that in the placebo, you're setting expectations. You're expecting a drug, but you get a saline or a sugar pill, but the expectation has set off those systems. So if we could harness that and recognize that the drug is doing a mechanistic thing, but on top of it, you've got this free extra thing you could do, which is to drive positive expectation. Wouldn't that be a great thing? So we did some experiments to prove that very point, which is whilst actually on a drug, an intravenous dose of a very powerful analgesic, if you change people's expectations, even though they're giving the same amount of pain and the same amount of drug, if I pretend I stop the infusion when I don't, they go back to baseline levels of pain. All that good benefit of the drug is gone just because of negative expectation, making them anxious and making them drive other brain networks that turn up the volume. And then if I sneakily give them the drug without them knowing, I get a little bit of pain relief. But then when I tell them they're going to get the drug, even though they're already on it, I'm now adding positive expectation because they think, oh, great, I'm going to get that drug now. And I get free analgesia on top. So I can go from a situation where there's lots of brain activity, and when there's no expectation, but you get a drug, there's a little bit of attenuation or dampening. But when I, on this situation here with no expectation, and then when I tell them, here comes the drug, I can dampen it even more with that free one. And then if I tell them I've stopped the drug when I haven't, I can get them to go back to lots of brain activity, baseline levels of pain, even though actually the drug's still in there. So these expectations are really important. And this is just a quick summary of an experiment to prove this importance of the patient-physician interactions and setting up expectations. And colleagues of mine in the Nuffield Orthopedic Hospital, Andy Carr and David Beard, did this wonderful study that I was peripherally involved with, which is to do a clinical study. We actually do have some imaging data on this. We're still analysing it, which is to test whether a very, very common shoulder pain surgery was actually doing something mechanistically to fix the pain, or was it placebo? And to cut a long story short, what they powerfully showed in this clinical trial was one of the most common shoulder surgeries done, a very big ticket item in US, is in fact driven by placebo analgesia. Now, if that's what you need to do to drive those mechanisms, is bring the patient into hospital and give them an anesthetic, pretend to give them a surgery when you don't, and that's what you need to do to drive the mechanisms, maybe that's what we should be doing. And this raises really interesting ethical debates and discussions. Well, the other area I mentioned was maladaptive plasticity, and this idea that if you just leave pain unmet, untreated, because sadly it is the case that most of our drugs aren't working particularly well for patients, although with all that new biology discovered, we're in such a good place going forward with lots of new exciting targets and lots of new things coming through the drug pipeline. So I'm very optimistic about the future. But right here, right now, it is bleak for our patients, and they do suffer tremendously. And of course, with sadly the wars around the world, we have a lot more young soldiers with limbs missing, and that can produce devastating pain. So can you imagine? Bad enough to have chronic pain, but to have a pain in a limb that's not even there. And this has been really thought of as something that is driven by maybe what we call maladaptive plasticity, the brain rewiring and driving the pain. It's a complex set of data that I've been working with a wonderful colleague who's now working down at UCL, Tamar Macon, who led on these studies. And it's just a nice example of, again, of quite quickly discovering new understandings and mechanisms that explain maybe what is really going on with phantom limb pain. And what was shown was that, in fact, their representation of the missing limb was perfectly normal compared to control. So it was as if they had the limb. The brain is still, in effect, functional. But the conversation between one side of the brain and the other, which is normally quite a healthy chat that goes on in normal activity for controls, is not there for amputees. So the more the connectivity between one side of the brain and the other is down in the amputees, the more pain they're in. So how about using brain zapping and driving that conversation and zapping the brain, which we can do with these tools, which we can just bolt on and just boom. They can literally put a little gel pack on and take the battery pack home and zap the brain through it. And we can drive the conversation better. If we can drive the conversation and correct it, maybe we can take this person with this high pain who's got low connectivity, we can get that conversation going up to here and bring them down. And this, again, was a trial that was done and led by Tamar's group and produced terrific analgesia for these patients. So again, it's a nice, just simple illustration of basic discovery science, giving us new mechanisms, understanding under the bonnet what's going on, and then coming up with a therapy that looks potentially quite powerful. The final frontier, as I mentioned, is to understand the risk factors. What is it about your journey from being a baby with a brain like this through adolescence to adulthood? What is it that, and why is it that we know that the predisposing factors for chronic pain is being female, being older, having adverse life events, and being a catastrophizer, sort of excessive worrying about things. And so we have a much better understanding now of how that life journey might sculpt and shape your brain such that you end up with non-resilience or vulnerability in key networks, including that descending system, good cop, bad cop, that means that you might have a vulnerability towards developing chronic pain to, say, getting diabetes, to, say, going on to chemotherapy agents, which again can affect the nerves. And so that's the frontier that we're trying to understand right now so that we can put in hopefully preventive measures if we can identify the areas that again speak to this lack of resilience or vulnerability. So for those who are, that's just a whistle-top tour, just a couple of experiments. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is come up with really good metrics. So the next frontier, as well as the vulnerability question, is to work more with other groups that are specializing in genetics or in more biopsychosocial understanding of pain, the biochemistry. Obviously, I'm down in this quadrant with the imaging phenotypes. And what we know is that one biomarker is not going to do it. We need to build lots of composite biomarkers, almost like a Rubik's Cube, that for each individual, a particular combination of how their brain is functionally and structurally and chemically set up, their genetics, their lifestyle, their biochem, all of that together in a combinatorial code will uniquely for that individual person predict the likely trajectory or the likely efficacy of a particular treatment. So I'm really excited that, you know, the big push now is to work in these big consortia, lots of collaborative works internationally and nationally, and to try and develop platforms where we've got a much better a sort of database of all this information. And then we can start to, again, do this composite biomarker signatures, which we can then roll out, and that we hope will accelerate and improve drug discovery. And there's another, review for those who are interested. I'm sure these slides can all be made publicly available for people to take all these references if they want them. So if you like what you've heard and you want to hear a lot more, I've done a few radio programs and other bits and pieces, and there's been a few articles there. So again, all of this is on the website for folks to read, and that can give you a better understanding. But the most important slide is to thank these guys. This is my team and my collaborators. They're absolutely fantastic people that we work with. And I've been so fortunate over the years to have all these terrific researchers drawn from many different interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary backgrounds. So a big shout out to the wonderful people I collaborate with and the team, and their names are listed here. I'm sorry that there isn't time to read all that. that. And again, the other acknowledgement, of course, I must make is to all our terrific funding councils and agencies who've very kindly and generously supported us over the years. And with that, I'm really excited to take some questions.
Irene, thank you very much indeed. That wasn't painful at all, I have to say. In fact, extremely interesting. Except, of course, I did notice in the middle your threat to burn me, and that, of course, was a just penalty.
Anytime.
Of course. Well, of course, a just penalty for forgetting to mention, of course, that you are, of course, now Warden of Merton College, yet another in the list of very distinguished positions that you hold. So, all Mertonians, we managed to make sure that we've got that in. As you can imagine, there's quite a few questions come in, and what I'm going to do is just bunch them together, I think, a little bit, to because a lot of them are actually in quite similar themes, and they get to some really interesting areas. One that's come in is asking actually about comparability across species. So you've been talking rightly about, what we see in our own systems, but we are aware, of course, at least that, mammals and actually, most animals do seem to feel pain in some sense. And then we become less clear, I think, about how far it goes down the tree of life, so to speak. Could you tell us more about the comparability of pain and maybe, some of the kind of the history of that science?
It's a great question. Yeah. So there is obviously pain's old, so it's one of the sort of survival basic things. So in fact, in many regards, there's a terrific amount of commonality and overlap, because on an evolutionary level, it's really important to experience pain. That's in its sort of everyday good acute pain. So that's the first thing to say. Obviously, as from the brain's perspective, in terms of pain as a perception, the human brain has obviously elements that are quite different. And again, that comparative, what we call anatomy, between how a human brain works and as you go down the sort of tree to different brains is different. So again, the way the network might be represented would be just different, because you couldn't map on anatomically a human brain, say, to a mouse brain. But the essence of what's there in terms of bits of the brain that need to tell you where the pain is, how intense it is, what are you going to do about it, again, although expressed differently, is still in nuts and bolts essence there. And I think what's exciting going forward to do is to do more comparative analysis, because I think that could give us a much better sense of what the key core bits are that are needed if you're going to build a system that could experience pain. And again, do that comparative analysis across the sort of, phylogenetic tree. But yeah, it's there, it's old. You could go back to, again, even a sea slug, in a very simple nocifensive reaction to something threatening the environment, it would release a dye. And that's a classic nocifensive reaction to sort of hide and protect itself. So again, it's old and it's core and it's shared.
Thanks for that, Irene. I see that actually quite a few questions have come in on one particular theme, so I'm going to sort of lump together as one question, and I'm sure this won't be the first time you've heard this. You've talked quite a lot about how circumstances, for instance, a GP telling you you're going to get a placebo is going to reduce your pain, and then it does. But how far is it possible to self-generate this? We've had questions about meditation, we've had questions about mental acuity, we've had questions about self-training. Is there a story there to tell about self-generated pain control?
Yeah, another great question. So there have been studies done with imaging, looking at sort of hypnosis, meditation, acupuncture. And I think that's been really interesting, because those sort of complementary alternative medical approaches, which people use, and for many thousands of years people use acupuncture, now we're getting the scientific understanding. So actually there's evidently some physiology there to be understood and to show that it does something. So there's no doubt about that. We're not quite sure how it works, so I think of meditation, those as something a bit different. In terms of managing your own expectations, you can think of it as sort of placebo light and placebo heavy sort of version. So if you're fully unaware and the full sort of, if you like, deception, I hate to use that word, but it's the best way to do it, then you'll have the full Monty placebo effect. But even if you're told, and again, there's been clinical trials done in patients who've been told this is a sugar pill, it has no active ingredient. But these experiments show that if you take it and you believe in it and you can drive these systems that exist in the brain, and you can have the benefit. And people will have a significant improvement in their pain. It's not as much as the full. So again, it's a spectrum, which again taps into how effective these manipulations, as I call them, get those networks to work. So the full one would really drive that sort of frontal system, expecting a certain thing. It's really working hard. If there's a sense that, okay, I've been told it's a sugar pill, it's going to be a bit less, but you're still going to drive the network and have some benefit to it. So now doing it yourself, more difficult, because again, that's even more challenging to sort of delude yourself. So that would be more where maybe you'd be saying there'd be other ways you want to tap into that same descending pain modulatory system and boost that good cop. And that would be knowing that also in parallel, if you distracted yourself, if you reframed what the pain meant, that similarly will tap into those systems and get them going.
I think that leads to quite a nice question that's just come in on Facebook from Mohammed. And he's asking a question which takes something that was implicit in what you're saying, Irene, and making it more explicit in his question. That is, are people suffering from emotional disorders more vulnerable to developing chronic pain? Is there a sort of direct relation in that direction?
Yep, we don't know yet. So again, the key factors that predict and give us some sort of statistical proof of what is a predictive factor for developing chronic pain is the works in progress at the moment. Certainly what's known from some studies that have been done looking at, say, patients pre-surgically, like going in for a hernia repair and then seeing who ends up in a persistent pain afterwards, would show that there's a constellation of factors that seem to. So again, sort of illness behavior, again, the sort of anxiety and the sort of mood alterations. These are very, very powerful factors that seem to contribute to, again, an increased likelihood of developing persistent pain. So again, it's going back to that picture I showed about adverse life events and catastrophizing, those sorts of things we know now, and we have a much better understanding how do they intersect with, again, these brain networks that we know are very important for conferring resilience. And again, it comes back to issues around those descending systems, because the stress axis, so anxiety and the stress axis system, is accessing that descending brainstem system, the good cop, bad cop. So now you can see how a disturbance in your stress and lack of sleep and anxiety suddenly could upset the balance of that system, because those systems are wired into that brainstem system. So again, this is what we all hypothesize, but we need to prove it now.
I'm just going to note in passing that Stephen on Facebook has said that he finds it interesting to see the similarities between this biological view on networks and transmission and sociological and leadership theories about leading teams, people, and social networks. So maybe that's a connection that some people might have had. I'm going to throw in a question actually here, from a colleague here at Oxford, a distinguished scholar in her own right, Anita Avramides. And she's asking, out of curiosity, she says hastily at the beginning, can a knowledgeable neuroscientist like yourself, Irene, negate the placebo effect if you're in the circumstance of experiencing pain? So in other words, if someone like you who knows the biology, the neurobiology of what's going on, can you short circuit it in a way that, muggins like me probably wouldn't be able to do?
Well, I should confess, I'm hopeless when it comes to pain. So I'm an absolute wimp when it comes to it. So I'm not the best example. I mean, the trouble is, when you know too much, well, it can go in both ways. You can certainly know what to do. So I do quite a lot of long distance, well, not quite a lot, but I do some long distance runnings, like marathon running. So I know how to interpret, again, good pain from sort of bad pain. So I'll be able to disambiguate, something that I know is a nagging injury versus just what I would reframe as a very positive pain, because I've done a long training run and that means I'm on target to, succeed in my goal. So being able to sort of interpret the pain from another. But in terms of tricking myself, I think the trouble is I know too much. So I'm one that will default to sort of just not wallowing in it, but certainly not being particularly robust when it comes to experiencing pain, certainly with childbirth anyway.
Absolutely fair enough. As we are coming up towards time, I'm going to begin to wind up, but I'll just say this has been a revelation for all of us, for people like me, whose greatest knowledge of neurobiology comes from the classic 60s comedy The Brain, which you may have seen starring David Niven as a man who has a brain much larger and much more sensitive than everyone else around him, with no doubt hilarious consequences. And I feel much better informed than even David Niven could make me at this stage.
Please.
But last question to you, with your head of lab, head of department hat on, Irene. And it's a question we've asked a lot, actually, the researchers who've been speaking to us during Oxford at Home. What's the next big breakthrough that either you think is coming or that you'd like to see in your field? In other words, what should the rest of us be looking out for next from you and your lab?
All right. Well, not. So I'll start with, first of all, just the big breakthrough generally. I think basically I've hinted at this throughout my talk. Currently, the drugs available to treat chronic pain patients aren't particularly effective. So, and they're drugs that are used for other disorders, but they're just used over and they're okay effective. What we really need in this new way we think about chronic pain as disease in its own right, new mechanistic understanding, new targets. There is now coming through the pipeline some very exciting new drugs that are going to target, again, the new mechanisms. And I'm really optimistic and excited about how those are going to play out. So that's going to be great, because that's going to really deliver effective drugs to patients, and I hope soon. And then from my own personal lab's perspective, the big sort of areas that we're interested in is to really use UK Biobank. So this is this extraordinary resource that we have in the UK. It's been established by many colleagues in Oxford, led by Sir Rory Collins. 500,000 people being phenotyped and genotyped and looked at, and 100,000 of those 500,000 have had their brains imaged. And now we've colleagues of mine have done a deep phenotyping of many of those patients in terms of pain. So for the first time, we're going to have 100,000 image brains, and we're going to be able to answer some of those questions I suggested about vulnerability, resilience, because we'll have the sheer numbers to understand what is the genetic link to how the brain is maybe developed to a vulnerable or resilient state, and what is it that is predictive of who's likely, if they do get cancer and they need to get onto chemotherapy, can we years ahead say you're likely to have a vulnerability towards chronic pain, this is what we should do preemptively. So that's the big piece of work that we want to do in the lab going forward, and it's using big data, it's big consortia, big collaborations, and I'm really excited. I'm happy to come back in a few years and see what the results are, but that's what we're going to work on.
I think that sounds like a must-have for a future series of Oxford at Home, even when we are, I hope, no longer having to be at home, but nonetheless, I think talking about the exciting things that are going on here at Oxford. Irene, that's been an absolute eye-opener, and I think none of us will stub our toes and scream in a spirit of ignorance again. At least we will know what is going on and how to engage with it, placebo-like or otherwise. So thank you so much for your time today. A reminder to everyone watching, first of all, that if you'd like to hear Irene's talk again or pass it on to others to hear, it'll be like all our previous series of Oxford at Home talks online, and you can find the descriptions under the on the webpage described just below the video section. Also, don't forget that we've got more science coming up for you next week. Is there life on Mars? I'm afraid we actually probably won't be able to answer that question next week, but the question, are there volcanoes on Mars? The answer is absolutely yes. And Dr. Ben Fernando will be talking to us about the seismology project that he has been working on. So if Olympus Mons is your thing, and frankly, whose thing is it not, then join us at the same time, 12:45 p.m. GMT, or whatever time it is for you around the world, next Friday, the 12th of March. And we'll look forward to seeing you and hearing from you then. Until then, from Professor Irene Tracey, from me, Ron Amitter, and from Oxford at Home, thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend.